Good evening, good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV. And a slightly misleading introduction there because I want to kind of pretend that we were doing the same discussions we were talking about last week, but actually we're going to go much more serious. The whole topic we've been talking about over these last few days and weeks has been the push into Germany, crossing the Rhine, getting into the heartland of the Third Reich, and bringing this awful war to a conclusion. But what was happening at the same time as the fighting into Germany, directly as a result of that, was the discovery and liberation of the concentration and other types of Nazi camps by the Allies. And to talk about this final chapter of the Holocaust story, although there's war crimes and things that came later and survivors guild and all that kind of stuff, we're going to talk about that right now. And that I'm going to have directly from the Holocaust History Podcast is my friend Waitman Beorn, and we're going to unravel and unpick this subject of the liberation of the camps. So good evening, Wade. How are you today? Waitman, how are you today?
I'm great. I'm glad to be living in the UK.
Yeah, well, let's not go too much down that path. But we were just having a conversation about that whole bigger subject of the separation of Holocaust history with military history and how you whether they should be kept on separate tracks or whether they tie up. And personally, I always feel if you can't talk about Barbarossa without talking about ideology, otherwise it doesn't have any meaning. But this 1945 period we're in the 80th anniversary of now, I have been treating it separately on this channel. There's been the battles across the Rhine, and then there's going to be content coming up about the survivors of the camps. But how do we bring those subjects together, and should we bring those subjects together?
Well, I'm going to say, obviously, I've always said this, that, that the Holocaust is inseparable from the war for all kinds of different reasons. But it is an event that is impacted by the fortunes of the war, and our memory of it is impacted by the fortunes of the war in a lot of ways. And some like the stuff that we're going to be talking about, tonight, the ways in which the military and who liberated what has very much influenced our understanding of the Holocaust, and of what the sort of archetypal Holocaust experience was, even to the extent that actually the liberation of camps begins in the summer of 1944, because the Red Army is doing it.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
But when we talk about it in sort of the Western world, it's 1945. That's when the British and the Americans began liberating German camps. But actually, that had been going on already, before we get there.
Yeah, very good point. So we've got a handful of slides, and we'll just have kind of an open conversation. But remind us really you've kind of summarized it there. The liberation of some of these places began in 44. But what was happening in terms of the Third Reich's trying to predict what was going to happen? They've had this mechanism in place. They've been murdering people by their million. They've been forcing people to do extraordinarily hard work for the Reich, but they realize their empire is beginning to crumble around them. So what did policy change as you get to the winter of 44, 45?
It's really interesting because in some ways, the Nazis follow kind of a bipolar, contradictory kind of policy with regards to the slave laborers, right? And of course, we'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about what wasn't liberated. But we're not talking at this point about, with the exception of Auschwitz, the extermination centers, the places that sort of have the gas chambers and that kind of stuff. We're talking mainly about concentration camps that, beginning in 1942, were often serving very much as, in addition to horrible places where lots of people died and were killed, were also serving as reservoirs for forced labor. And so as the Reich begins shrinking, and again, a lot of this begins in 1944, right, with Operation Bagration, with the Soviet massive advance into Central Europe. And you have a bizarre sort of situation where at the same time the Nazis are very often trying to evacuate these slave laborers from various camps in the East, camps and ghettos and other places, and also cover up the evidence of what they've done, which sometimes involves murdering those same prisoners. And so again, here you have a great connection between the fortunes of war and what happens. The places that the Allies will liberate later, and we'll talk about this: Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. The scenes that we will see there of just these massive overcrowding of people, um, hundreds and hundreds of corpses, et cetera, et cetera. That's all a result of the evacuations of camps
Mm.
from the east. That's not what those places looked like, from their inception up until 44 or so. They weren't nice places. They were horrible places. People were being murdered, tortured, killed, etc. But really, the sort of mass sites of death and emaciated prisoners and starvation and disease, most of that is a result of this massive influx of people from Eastern Europe, forced to move west as the Red Army is advancing, sometimes via trains, but oftentimes on these death marches, by foot as well. So again, you sort of have this: the Nazis are trying to conserve their slave labor, even though it's not really super valuable for them, but it's almost kind of um, like a reflex, I suppose.
Mm.
That there's two reasons, and one is keep the labor because it's valuable, and also there's definitely the thought that we don't want these people falling into the hands
Yeah.
of the Allies because they're witnesses, to the Holocaust.
And you touched on it there, and I want you to expand on that. It was going to be your first point, is that when we think, for example, in terms of geography of World War II in Europe, we can see that cities were held by one side at some point of the war, and then later on maybe they change hands, and at some point they are then taken and they become liberated. Although where the further east you go, the harder it is to you define it by the word liberation, but they are fought for. But one of the points you wanted to make is, although we have this vision of the liberation of the camps, there are camps that have their role has gone. They've finished their work. So talk about what wasn't liberated, because 45 was years into the program, wasn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I think this is really important. In a certain sense, um, some of the most important sites of the Holocaust, in the sense of the ones where hundreds of thousands, millions of people are murdered, with the exception of Auschwitz, are not liberated at all.
Yeah.
So I'm talking now about, um, the Operation Reinhard camps, so
Yeah.
Sobibor, Treblinka, and Belzec, as well as Kelmno, which was another one of these extermination sites. And these are the places where we think about, beginning in, usually more or less in 1942, though Kelmno begins in December of 1941. These are the places where people arrive by train. Um, they get off the train, their hair's cut, and within 30 minutes they're dead in a gas chamber. And so a place like Treblinka, which murdered around 850,000 human beings, um, run by 90 SS men and about 100 Ukrainian guards. Um, but these places, for the most part, are, with the exception of Auschwitz and Majdanek, have all shut down, um, already in 1943. Belzec shuts down in December 42, because in the case of Belzec, they have no more customers, as it were,
Mm.
because all of these Reinhard camps are set up in eastern Poland, in a certain proximity to major population centers: Warsaw, Lublin, Lviv, Krakow, and they are there to murder the Jews from those cities. And eventually, most of those folks that are going to be murdered have already been murdered, and there's no point in them continuing. And then in the case of Sobibor and Treblinka, there are uprisings at those two camps, that both damage the camps and give the SS further impetus uh, to end them. And so there's this nice aerial photograph here in 1944. This is what Treblinka looked like, because the last thing that happens at Treblinka is they force the Jews to level the site, destroy all of the buildings down to the ground, plant trees, um, on the site, and they build, in this case of Treblinka, they build a farmhouse out of the bricks from the gas chamber, and they put one of the former Ukrainian guards in it to pretend like he's a farmer. Um, and I mean, ironically, the farmer and his family, the Ukrainian guard and his family, fled before the Soviets got there. But these are not places where we have these iconic scenes of gates opening and prisoners coming out, and yet in some sense, they are some of the most important sites of the Holocaust. And of course, there's a whole operation whose sole purpose is to go to these camps and dig up, because in many of these places, again, Auschwitz is different from a lot of these places in that Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor don't really have crematoriums. They don't have these sort of oven buildings that Auschwitz does. At first, the bodies are just buried in pits, and then later on, they're burned in these sort of open air fires that the Nazis called griddles, because they use railway lines to sort of make like a grill sort of formation. But there's a whole operation led by the SS to go back to these places, dig up the bodies, burn them to ash, crush the remaining bone fragments into dust, and scatter them all over the world or the area. And so again, these places are not liberated. These places have to be investigated later on, but most of them are out of the way anyway, and so they're not. So the first place that gets liberated is Majdanek, which is I guess sort of the next place that we go, I think, on the slides. Oh yeah, and one of the things to note, and this goes along with that, is that again, I'm not here as a cheerleader for the Soviets, but the Soviet Union has been investigating Nazi crimes since 1942. They established what's called the Extraordinary State Commission, and it has a whole bunch of other words after it. But basically, they have been going around to towns and villages and taking stock of everything the Nazis stole, broke, burned, destroyed, and who they killed, and have been documenting it. And a lot of this information is actually really, really useful, particularly the reports at the lower level. The higher up they go, the sort of more general they get, and then the more politicized they get. But this is just an image from the camp that I work on. They're some of the survivor testimony that I used in the book comes in September 1944. From the freshest testimony that we have is from the Soviets, and so and of course, obviously, they have a political motivation for doing this, right? I mean, obviously, this is in part propaganda, because they want to show the Nazis are bad, but that doesn't mean it's wrong or untrue either. And for us historians, it's left us with a lot of really great documentation.
It's ironic though that documentation is, and we're going down a massive rabbit hole, is some of the documentation that the people use to try and say the Holocaust didn't happen, because the Soviets are a faulty witness to some extent. It's all just fabricated. But I should remind people, folks, I'll put the link in the description below to Waitman's website, because his book Between the Wires, you can find out about it on the website there, and also via the podcast. But one of the things I think I want to move on to as well is that the fact that this idea about separating the Holocaust from military history, some people have, is that the period we're talking about, late 44, 45, particularly on the channel recently, is the period when it's all about logistics, militarily. The Germans haven't got enough to do everything. And yet, as for example, when Operation Comrade is happening out in Hungary, they're still trying to, they've just been murdering Hungary's Jews. They're putting so much effort into, as you say, covering up what they've already done, which is done. It's happened, and still killing people, and yet they're losing the war. And that I can't get my head around the fact that they're favoring their ideology over trying to maintain their grip on the war. And do you, as a Holocaust historian, have an explanation for that? I mean, essentially they're doubling down, aren't they?
Well, yeah, and I want to come back to that, but I want to really quickly touch on the irony of the Soviet war crimes investigation.
Yeah,
because it gets even more ironic than that. Because as we all know, in 1939 and 1940, the Soviets murdered around 20,000 Polish POWs, right? In the Katyn Forest and in other places. And one of the people that found them are the Nazis in 1941 when they get into Eastern Poland, and they do a forensic war crimes investigation of of the Katyn forest massacre sites, excavating bodies, identifying victims, identifying methods, and they claim that they, rightly so, right, that the Soviets did it. And of course, the Soviets deny this after the war and claim that the Germans did it and made it all up. So you have these really interesting ironies, which we can talk about in a different time. But getting back to your original question, I would argue that actually the Holocaust doesn't take that much logistics. Holocaust trains had the lowest priority on the rails, which is why it often took them, exponentially longer to get from place to place than a normal train route. They had to stop and pull over to allow troop trains to go by. And again, going back to Treblinka, in the space of less than a year, Treblinka murdered 850,000 human beings. And it only required around 20 or 30 SS men and around 120 Ukrainian guards. That's it. One of the sad facts is that it just doesn't take that much logistics. And again, even during the evacuations in 1944-45, there are logistical shortages, but the solution is to march them, because again, that's not a logistical problem for the Nazis, because they don't need to put them on trains, because if they die, they don't care. And so you have these, massive death tolls of these death marches. But ultimately, I think it's kind of a false dichotomy that there is a logistical drain, if you will, on the Third Reich as a result of the Holocaust. And of course, for the Nazis, the Holocaust is just a different front in the same war. And it's not less than, it's not competing with, it's, they would no sort of sooner stop the Holocaust than they would stop fighting on the Western Front to fight on the Eastern Front. It's part of the national sort of mission. And I think that's part of the sort of critical element as well. When the gas chambers close, they go back to shooting people. But it's not, I think at scale, it's not, the manpower is not that an issue. I mean, like there's only 3,000 initially, only 3,000 men in the Einsatzgruppen to cover all of the Soviet Union. And the Einsatzgruppen, along with their allies, end up murdering around 2 million Jews in the Soviet Union just by shooting. So I mean, a lot of people sort of like to pose this question as kind of hypothetical, but I actually don't think there's really that big a drain. I mean, I think the biggest place, and we can move on because I know this is the point of the conversation. But I think the biggest place where the Holocaust and actually the Nazi genocidal project writ large is detrimental to the war effort is in the morale element, and in the fact that it particularly, I mean, not just the Holocaust, but also the murder of repression of various different groups studies in Europe loses them popular support, that could have been really useful, in the war. But I don't think it's necessarily logistical, back and forth.
So let's continue the discussion about the fact the Soviets were the first to liberate any of these sites, and the West are to some extent getting their information from the Soviets. Obviously, they have their own aerial intelligence. They have some information from Ultra, but does the information about what's being found kind of get put on the front page in terms of amongst the hierarchy immediately, or was it a drippy effect? What's happening in terms of preparation for the Western allies as they push towards Germany? Because we've talked at length on this channel recently about the build-up of amphibious operations, getting all the US Army trains up to the front, getting all the engineering in place. But there must have been a realization that they're also going to be pushing into the environment of these camps. So what had the Soviets learned, and what did they pass on to the Western allies about what they were going to be facing?
It's a great question, and to be honest, I'm not sure specifically, what those transfers of information looked like. What we can say, of course, is the British have known about the Holocaust since 1941.
Yeah.
They're reading the Einsatzgruppen reports, and they know about the mass shootings, and for a long time they don't share that with the US for various reasons. And already by 42, 43, we know that we know more about Auschwitz, we know about the killing centers. And I'd say this becomes more complex, of course, because we know leaves a lot of ambiguity about who knows and who knows what at what levels. And so certainly the governments knew a lot about what was going on. The average individual may not, though. Again, it also depends on what communities you're in. American Jewish communities actually were very well informed about what was happening, and were able to to share that information. Obviously, the Western Allies knew about concentration camps. But I think one of the things that is a good point that you're bringing up here is actually that the image of concentration camps that we had predominantly from the pre-war era, 33 to 39, is actually not anywhere close to what the soldiers are going to experience for the most part.
Yeah.
When they get there, because again, as I mentioned earlier, they're getting there at this time where, at Buchenwald, it's getting tens of thousands of additional prisoners and it's not even ready for. And so it becomes this place of sort of mass dying and mass death that is different even than just the idea of what these camps were that people may have known about. And again, if you look at the propaganda, I think that the Allies are giving their soldiers about why Nazis are bad, I think it's fairly vanilla in the sense of, they're not talking about the Holocaust in detail. They're talking about, the authoritarianism, the fascism, that kind of stuff. And that's why Nazis are bad. They're not really talking about the Holocaust, which is why when you listen to some of the liberators talking about their experiences, they talk about, like, I knew Nazis were sort of bad in a general way, but I didn't understand it until I was standing in one of these places because I just wasn't prepared for that to be a thing.
And we've got a link in the description below to one of the survivors that you think is a particularly a good example of what these American GIs experience, as well as British Tommies and Soviet Red Army personnel finding these things. And it's easier for us to some extent 80 plus years on to understand the full horrors because we've seen the footage. But prior to having seen it, it would be difficult to explain to anybody that another group of people could be that cruel. Your imagination couldn't go as far as reality, I think. And so I suppose it's fair to understand that the information that people had wasn't as severe as it was, because who could have thought that things could get as bad as they did?
Yeah. I mean, it's a sort of sad statement of our times that, now we consider concentration camps, genocide as a normal thing. I mean, I don't mean normal, but it's a thing that happens. We know it's happened. It's happened lots of times. But you're right at that point. And even during the Holocaust, one of the challenges for Jews was that they'd experienced persecution before. They'd experienced, pogroms, but this was a new thing. And it took a while to figure out that, like, there were factories, these systematic places created with the sole purpose of murdering people. That's a new sort of thing.
So we've got a photo on screen there of the film footage of Auschwitz.
If you click on it, it should be a GIF. It should actually. Can you make it?
No, it's not. It's not moving. No, sorry,
okay.
I didn't realize that. It's just a solid image, unfortunately. But
no worries.
That's my mistake. But
no worries.
One of the things I want to discuss with you is the reaction of the different forces policy-wise. I mean, you can't stop an individual soldier, whether he's from Moscow or New York's particular reaction to the horrors they see, but there surely had to be different sort of policy instructions at a kind of a higher level about what was to be the procedure. Or was it very much individual commanders discovering individual camps going about their own way? I mean, and for example, we had a question from Ian: did the Soviets invite the Western Allies to visit the early camps discovered, for example?
Excuse me, sorry. That's a great question. I don't know. I mean, it would have been harder for them to visit, Majdanek or Auschwitz, really. I mean, in January of 45 or in July 44, just based on the war. Those are not easily accessible places. I think one thing that all the Allies had in common was that they were not prepared for this. They did not prepare their soldiers for this. And at least in the early days, weeks, and months, there wasn't a sort of systematic response because militaries in general are, up until the present day, are generally not prepared to do civil affairs kinds of things, and this is what was really demanded of liberators of camps, and even then, what constituted a liberator is a moving target as well. Dachau is a great example. That there are like multiple units that claim to be the ones that liberated Dachau. One of them was the first one to drive up to the gate and kind of look in. Another one was the first one to enter the camp. Another one was the first one to sort of begin to take care of the prisoners there. And they all sort of claim to be liberators. And that's fine. But again, it means that some soldiers stayed for 10 minutes, and some stayed for a couple hours, and some stayed for weeks, depending on what the sort of situation was. The Soviets, the Red Army soldiers are not, just because they're Soviets doesn't mean that they're not human. And I think many of them were, deeply shaken. And of course, there are Jews fighting in the Red Army who also would have a special reaction, perhaps, to the places they're liberating. Conversely, you also have Soviets that are sort of, saying, "What are you doing here? Why didn't you escape?" and this kind of thing. And in some senses, in some situations, you have Soviets, sexually assaulting Holocaust survivors. It's a very, and that's part and parcel of the larger, Soviet policy, I suppose, of rape, mass rape that takes place in Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany. Anyway, and so that's one issue. On the Americans, on the Allied side, again, you have a variety of responses, to these places, but they're all unexpected because in really nowhere, with the exception of Patton trying to rescue his, I guess his son-in-law, I think, from a POW camp. The mission is never liberate this camp. It's always, the mission is, you're advancing along in this sector to kill Germans and take ground. And if you happen to find a camp, you find a camp.
Yeah.
So no one's really sort of prepared either, from a planning perspective or from an emotional perspective for these places.
I wanted to touch on get more into the subject of this, the process of the minute someone finds the camps, because we've got a show with my friend Ed Brooks in a few weeks' time on the unit that he serves with in the British Army, which is a unit that I hadn't even heard it before until he mentioned the Queen's Own Oxfordshire Hussars, part of the 8th Corps, who are literally the first troops to go to Belsen. And how they had, as you said, they had no idea. It was just somewhere along the road they were moving down as sort of a reconnaissance unit. And, we have, as a Holocaust historian, one of the best arguments for the information about the Holocaust is the huge amount of documentation there is about it all. And we have all the footage of Eisenhower and other authorities and the Red Cross going to these various places, although, as you said, some that had happened earlier and didn't have that coverage. But we have that information. But the first few moments seem to me to be very, very scary, very, very confusing. And I think maybe talking about that a little bit more is really interesting, because the point Edward's going to make is there's a potential of riot on their hands. Are the people they're liberating going to start murdering the guards? Is that okay? Morally, because a question mark. What do you do? Do you feed people? Do you not feed people? Because these are the questions. They've touched on it a little bit in things like Band of Brothers and about whether or not what to do. But that period of the immediacy of those first people there, how much understanding do we really have of that? Because, as you say, it was often very small numbers of people who came across those camps.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great point. And again, a lot of them, are good old reconnaissance troops, that are the first ones, ahead of main bodies, identifying all kinds of different, things. And they roll up, and sometimes they don't really go in. They sort of see this as a prison and they mark it as a prison and they move on. Because again, that's what reconnaissance is supposed to keep moving.
Yeah.
And it also depends on the camps. At Buchenwald and at Bauthausen, Buchenwald liberated by the Americans on 11 April, and Mauthausen much later in May. And this happened in other places too. The SS guards had actually fled, and kind of either handed the camp in some sense over to the prisoners, or literally sort of left unrelated formations holding the bag, like Volkssturm units or German army units that really had previously nothing to do with these camps, but were sort of, oh, now guard this thing, and the SS run out the door. And so in some places, the Allies are confronted with essentially like a welcoming committee of prisoners that has, in some sense, organized the liberation. But in other places,
kind of begun the process, sort of.
Have done some things already. But again, remember, there are over 40,000 camps and ghettos throughout Europe during the Second World War. And so, like for the place that in Band of Brothers they liberate, which I'm now blanking on, it's just a tiny little
near Lansdorf, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a tiny little place.
Yeah,
it's like it's a satellite camp. There's all kinds of these satellite camps, and so not everybody is stumbling upon Dachau or Auschwitz. A lot of people are stumbling on these little places. And again, I think the Band of Brothers episode does a really good job of sort of, the first kind of idea for a lot of the soldiers is, what is this? Like, I don't know what to do with this. Like, this is, I don't know. I don't understand this. And there's a lot of that. And then, and then to get to your other point, which I think is always quite interesting, the idea of reprisal and letting prisoners, essentially murder SS men and guards. And one of the greatest examples of this is at Dachau, because one of the American units going in, because again, it also depends on where you come in, right? So one unit that liberates Dachau actually hits the main gate first, and one unit actually comes in via the railway line, and sort of the back of the camp, and they stumble upon it with the so-called death train, which was a train that was sort of full of new prisoners arriving at the camp, again, as part of this mass evacuation, who had not really been allowed to leave the train. So they'd all died in the train. And at least one of the arguments that's put forth later is that some of the soldiers thought these were POWs, and they got really angry about it. And so at Dachau, you have a situation where, and I say this not obviously out of sympathy for the Nazis, but you have American soldiers committing a war crime and lining up and murdering guards, many of whom were actually not really associated with the camp. And there's an investigation of this that Patton eventually squashes. But it does go up to that level of a war crime, and people being lined up and machine gunned by liberating troops. Oftentimes prisoners do this themselves if they get a hold of POW or get a hold of guards. At Buchenwald, I think it's Buchenwald or Mauthausen, they killed 30 some guards that had been trying to sort of hide. And so again, it's for the initial people there, it's very much a confused, chaotic, and then from a sensory perspective, as some of your viewers have already mentioned, it's just a horrendous experience from every angle. Touch, taste, smell, sight, sound. It's a horrendous experience. And then, because militaries aren't designed really to handle these things, you have this sort of discovery learning of okay, who do we bring in? Like, we have, here's our table of organization and equipment. What units do we assign to come in and solve these problems? And in some cases, you have situations where, again, the Band of Brothers episode does a pretty good job of showing that, where prisoners left the camp and head into town, and they hit up a grocery store, and they die because they eat food that is so rich that their body can't handle it, and it kills them. And that really, for many of them, they did need to be kind of confined again in the same camp, so they could be their systems could be nursed back to a healthy system. Not to mention being treated for disease and injuries and that kind of stuff.
And to develop on that theme there, because obviously as a Holocaust historian, personal testimony of people who are victims is paramount to understand the experiences, because, as you said, in so many cases, the Third Reich removed as much evidence they could of the horrors there. So personal experience is of course important, but to then, as you said there, to be not treated the way you would hope to be treated. If you've managed to survive, possibly for years, one of these horrible places, and you've had your mind fixated on this idea of, like, yeah, the Allied prisoners of war in Colditz, it would be going out to the Ritz and having steak and chips on the, that would be the same type of mentality for these people inside these camps. Is that when I'm finally free from this, I will go to something and I will have whatever it is, their favorite meal. I will do this, and I will be able to experience the joy of liberation. And then you're saying that when people turn up, you can't just be allowed to walk out in the streets. You can't. And we have photos of both. We have photos of jubilant people who are embracing American and British and Canadian soldiers. And we had other people who just look almost as terrified with the Americans or Brits being there as they would have been with the Germans being there. So how do you unpick all that as a Holocaust historian? How do you, can you understand that some of the victims and prisoners were resentful, and how did people sit them down and explain it to them? How did they come to terms with that over the next few years?
I mean, I think one of the things that's, I think, really important to express to folks is that liberation, for example, liberation for downed Allied crewmen that you see in Masters of the Air,
yeah,
is a fundamentally different experience.
Exactly. Yeah.
Than it is particularly for Jews, but also for others that have spent long periods of time in the camp system. And of course, again, as a result of those mass evacuations, many of the Jews in these camps, Buchenwald, elsewhere, have been in 4 or 5 other camps.
Yeah.
Before then, to include Auschwitz, right? And for them, liberation, yes, they are happy at some level that they're not going to die, at least immediately. But now they're faced with the paralyzing realization that for many of them, not just their entire family, but their entire town or village is gone. And that their family may be split throughout the camp system if they're still alive, or across Europe. And imagine sort of surviving all of this and then having to find your family in an analog world where they could be anywhere in Europe.
Yeah.
I mean, and you don't know whether they're alive or not. And so, for many survivors, I think, and again, you can't generalize because everybody's experience is different, but for many of them, I think there's an impatience, not so much to have that sort of meal they've been thinking about, but to put their life back together and find their relatives, their wives, daughters, kids, parents. And so they're impatient to leave the camp for those reasons. And then you have just amazing stories sometimes of individuals who, again, somebody is from Ukraine and they end up in Weimar, Germany as a result of, being in various numbers of camps and evacuated. And, they're setting off by themselves on foot to try to find their family in Europe in the midst of the largest demographic movement of people in European history. And I think that's, for many of them, that's paralyzing, and it's not an amazing feeling. They're happy that the camp has been liberated, but I think very quickly they begin to think about these other things.
And I suppose they begin to have more long-term thoughts, whereas I'm assuming that from the accounts I've read of people in Auschwitz is that you're living from one roll call to a next roll call, one SS arsehole moving down your barrack indiscriminately shooting people. And if you survive that one, that's it. You're living a very immediate life where you're not projecting. You've survived one more day, and now suddenly, as you say there, you're now confronting the fact that the country you have come from may not exist anymore. You're as you say, your entire family, your entire community is gone, and you've got to now think about what that future may bring. And we don't, I guess, talk enough about the deaths that occurred after liberation, because of course, as you explained, the suffering didn't end, the diseases didn't go away, the cures were not instant. And and we talk about the binary dates of when World War II starts. We say 1939, but the Chinese would go, excuse me,
Yeah.
too late. And we talk about VE Day, and then we talk about VJ Day. But in terms of Holocaust history, it's not in anywhere over yet. And I'm not talking about just PTSD, and I'm talking about the actual getting back to a home, getting back to some kind of sense of normality. You've got DP camps for years.
And in Germany, you have, I mean, this is an aside, but in some places, Nazi doctors are killing mental patients and disabled children, months after liberation, until an American shows up and stops them. And you also have the challenge, particularly, I mean, again, this gets into the DP conversation, which I think is really important, and someone mentioned that in the chat as well. If you're a German Jew liberated from Buchenwald, you are an enemy national. And you are treated differently than if you were a Polish Jew liberated from Buchenwald, because that's your nationality is German, and that causes problems for the Allied administrators as well, to sort of sort out. And you have these very bizarre situations later where Dachau actually itself becomes a DP camp, and for refugees, and you have sometimes the experience of a Holocaust survivor in a camp, a refugee camp, a DP, a displaced persons camp, with former Nazis who are hiding as refugees in that same camp. And some mentioned it as well in the chat. The challenge also for a lot of these folks is, when they step out of Buchenwald, you are now in Germany, and you may be a rural Jew from Eastern Ukraine. And you have no idea anything. I mean, this is like a foreign country, literally a foreign country to you.
Yeah.
And then if you get back to your country, you have the challenge of the Soviets, but also the challenge that you're oftentimes not wanted there.
Yeah.
And if that's made very clear to you as well. One of the survivors from the Yanovska camp was in hiding for about a year after he escaped from the camp. He emerges from the camp, and people are like, "What are you doing here? Like, you're not supposed to be here anymore." And so there's that challenge as well. Not to mention the challenges we mentioned about sort of finding your families and those kinds of things.
No, and I'm thinking of that. One of the men who led the Sobibor revolt, Leon something or other, who got out, led it, and then was killed back in the city. He came back from wherever he was trying to make his life. He was murdered.
I mean, there are. I'm not that's the same one, but there are, again, to talk about the scale of the Holocaust for a second. The Belzec extermination center kills around 500,000 Jews. There are 2 survivors, 2 out of the approximately 400 to 500,000. One of them is murdered in 1946, 47 by Poles. And so there's also that element, and we're getting a little away from the camp.
Yeah. Well, it's all part. I mean, the one I was thinking of, I've just looked it up. Is Leon Feldhendler.
Yeah.
Yeah, who was killed in Lublin in 46. And that irony, awful, terrible irony of then being murdered by your own countrymen, and you have
again with the example of Soviet prisoners of war. A very small number, a tiny number of Soviet POWs survive in Auschwitz. They had some of the worst conditions when they were first sent there. When they're liberated, they go to a gulag, because to the Soviets, being captured was an indication of you've been compromised in some way, shape, or form. And so there was that challenge as well of the fact that you risk those kinds of things, and then this gets into a larger population issues with American policy towards what we do with refugees. Do we send them back to the Soviet zone, that kind of stuff, which is maybe beyond the scope of what we're talking about here.
No, there's always future conversations to have, but I want to bring it back to the change of mentality, if there was one, to not just the American, Soviet, and British soldiers on the ground, but the high command. I mean, we've got a show with Jason Lanza coming up about Eisenhower's particular response to the camps, and Patton, of course, has been in reaction to it. But the Why We Fight episode of Band of Brothers that we both are fans of, and you've had John Orloff and Ross McCall on your podcast, and I've had, I know John, and that it's that representation of that period there, writing about it, depicting it on screen, very complicated. But there is this commonly held idea that all the morale issues and desertion issues that have been going on through the winter of 44, 45 in the British and American and Canadian armies, everybody's fed up, everybody's knackered, they want to go home, they've seen too many friends die, there are deserters in Paris, there are deserters in Rome, etc., etc. Then suddenly, upon the liberation of the camps, which exactly what would that mean? Because as you say, that's been going on since 44 because there's thousands of them. But suddenly everyone goes, oh no, but this is why we're fighting. Let's keep on going. Can it be quantified in quite that simplistic way? Because as you say, then sometimes they're not even going in these camps. Is what in your experience effect did it actually have on on the morale and the incentives of soldiers?
It's a great question, and I have to second. I had Jason Lancer on the podcast as well. He's great, and his book on Eisenhower and the Holocaust is amazing. So I'll plug that for him as well. I think there are a couple ways to think about this. Eisenhower's experience is at the Ohrdruf camp, and Ohrdruf is basically the first camp that the Allies, the Americans, liberate, and he very presciently. He anticipates Holocaust denial, and he says, someday, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he knows that someday someone's going to deny that this was as bad as it was.
Yeah,
and he says, I'm not going to have that. And so he gets Patton and he gets Bradley and other folks to come visit Ohrdruf the day after it's liberated. Patton's a weenie and won't go in some of the barracks, where people are dying or dead or whatever, but Eisenhower does. He makes them go to all the places. He talks to the prisoners. He has them explain all of the stuff, everything that happened, what went on. He then writes back to Congress and he says, United States Congress, he says, you need to send politicians over, both parties, to tour these places. He arranges that. He arranges logistics to get the press over, and the British do too. And this is not an American thing. The British do that in Bergen-Belsen and other places, but Eisenhower is sort of the most vocal about his intentions here. And he says, getting back to your original question, he says that I want to get the quote right, but he says essentially something to the effect of, we are told the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for. Now at least he knows what he's fighting against. And I think that's a good way of putting it. I'm not sure that everyone becomes sort of ideologically knights in shining armor, but this is a hard thing to sort of square. I think the Germans take on the Wehrmacht. It takes on a different tone after this, right? Because now you're not just sort of fighting the Germans and we're two soldiers and we're fighting against each other. We can have a beer afterwards. You're fighting against somebody and you recognize that this is what they've been fighting. This is what they've been fighting for.
Yeah.
This is the Nazis have been fighting to keep this going. And that's, that is it's a visceral thing, literally, because you have a number of, and Eisenhower is of course interested in getting soldiers through as well.
Yeah.
It's not just the elites, but he wants the ordinary soldiers to sort of come through and see these places as well. And then later on, he makes the German civilians come through and see these places. And he makes German civilians from the neighboring towns be one that unearth the bodies and bury the bodies. And there are very powerful scenes of how upset, I'm not sympathizing with them, but how upset the German civilians are about having to do this. They're carrying bodies with their bare hands, and but this is Eisenhower's part of his really, I think, far-looking vision, because he's like, we got to make sure the Germans also can't say that they didn't know what was going on. And so, if you live next to Dachau, you're going to be the one pulling bodies out of barracks. But the video that I wanted to show that people should definitely take a look at, that it has a slightly different, I think, approach. It's a guy named Leon Bass, who's an African American. He was a combat engineer unit. He was involved in the liberation of Buchenwald. And he talks about the fact that he was very angry before he got there, but also during and after, because he's, here he is, an African American with definitely not equal rights in the United States, being discriminated against, oftentimes killed. And here he is fighting in an army in which he's a second-class citizen against racism, right? Of a form, against oppression of minorities. And for many African American soldiers, I think the camp experience, the liberation experience, if they had it, really highlights their own problem. This is why you get the double V, right? The double victory idea that World War II should also come with not just the liberation of European people, but the liberation of African Americans from the racist laws and system that they're suffering under in the United States. And he talks about in 1998, and again, this has given him some time to temper, I think, that being in the camp made him realize that his suffering was similar to other people's suffering, right? So there's sort of a cathartic element to it. But he also says, I've experienced that. So for him, again, it wasn't the Holocaust. He hadn't experienced a Holocaust in the United States of African Americans, but he had experienced repression and discrimination based on who he was. And that was really important to him. And I think for a lot of African Americans, that was something that they also experienced differently. I mean, Jewish soldiers also experienced liberation differently, because they have a different connection to those people. They literally see themselves in some of those inmates, those prisoners. So, I mean, I think, again, like anything else, it's hard to generalize what one takeaway is. But I think certainly it hardened resolve and made American soldiers, probably British soldiers as well, less likely to be lenient towards Germans. The Soviets didn't need any of that because they had already, suffered German occupation of their territory forever before they even got to liberating camps. And so they were already sort of at the level of not taking prisoners and being particularly cruel. If that makes sense.
It does make sense. And one of the things I like you anyway, because you're a mate, but one of the things I like about you is you have multiple hats, which is always a good thing, is that you are a Holocaust scholar, writer, educator, but you're also an army veteran, which is complementary, but also sometimes on slightly different paths. Because one of the subjects that has been coming up on this channel since sort of September last year is that after the Normandy breakout, the Allies are basically having to decide between, are we now trying to get geographical gains? Are we trying to liberate peoples within the geography we're moving through? Or are we trying to annihilate the German army? And they are all happening at the same time. And there's an overlap between them. But there is a debate as to what should we be doing. Should we be getting ports for logistics? Should we be getting over the Rhine and crushing the Germans? But at that time, of course, because history is only in the moment, you can't see the future. No one could have understood the complete response and reaction and overwhelming nature of what was going to happen when they were starting to discover the bigger, horrible extermination centers, which, as we said, then we now have the why we fight thing. Eisenhower, if nothing else, would have been his ideas of why he was doing what he was doing must have been crystallized when he's standing there looking at some of that stuff there. But has that meant that as historians, that we're now not looking at that period ahead of that in the correct way, when the debate wasn't about liberating camps. It was about the military objectives of annihilating the German army. Do you know? Can you get where I'm going with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a couple things to take away from that question. You know, one is, of course, let's be very clear: the Allied military strategy, as it relates to the persecution of the Jews and other folks by the Nazis, was never to liberate camps. It was never to take any action, any direct action, to stop the Holocaust.
Yeah.
The stated and followed policy from the State Department in the United States all the way down, and the military as well, was win the war. How do we save these people? We win the war. And there are a whole nother conversation. Somebody mentioned in the bombing Auschwitz. There's a whole nother conversation about that. There's lots of anti-Semitism in the American State Department and in parts of the American government. There are people that aren't super interested in doing anything going out of their way other than winning the war. And also, I mean, there are also pragmatic and realistic reasons about what could actually been accomplished anyway. So, you know, there's never a question of, do we go to this camp or do we fight the Germans? It's always destroy German combat power and cause them to surrender, and that's the best way to bring this to a quick conclusion. I'm going to take your question in a slightly different direction, because you talked about
please do.
the influence of liberation on the Holocaust, our understanding of the Holocaust. And I think this is a place that's actually really important, because of the fact that for Americans and for English folk, for UK citizens as well, our popular image of the Holocaust, beginning with 1945 and the liberation of the camps, is a German camps experience.
Yeah.
That's what we get, right? We get the propaganda films, we get the images. Sometimes we get the liberators talking about it. Many of the people that end up in the Western zone and end up immigrating to the United States or to Britain or to Australia have had this German camps experience, and that becomes sort of the archetypal Holocaust experience in people's popular imagination. You know, they don't think about Auschwitz so much for a very long time. They certainly aren't thinking about Treblinka and Belzec and Sobibor. They're certainly not thinking about the Holocaust by bullets, where around 2.5 million Jews are murdered one by one by bullets in Eastern Europe, because that's not the sort of popular image that comes about as a direct result of the liberation and all of the press and popular depictions of that. And so, you know, really up until the last 20 years, 30 years or so, the Holocaust in Eastern Europe has been more under the radar than, you know, the German camps and the experience of being in Buchenwald or being deported from, you know, France to Buchenwald. And I think it's really interesting too, because I always think that memory is actually really interesting. And I think that a lot of people actually really like to talk about memory, but they don't understand that they're talking about it when they are. But you know, that's the image that we get.
Yeah.
You know, we get the Band of Brothers, you know, liberation episode. We get the images of Eisenhower at Ohrdruf. We don't get, as a general population, right? The general public, for a very long time, doesn't get images and stories and, you know, camps from Eastern Europe. And that really changes the way that I think that we have thought about the Holocaust, have written about the Holocaust in popular media, you know, there's a very Western European focused. So I mean, I think part of that actually it begins with liberation. And I'm not suggesting, by the way, that there's any sort of nefarious plan to do that. It's what you know, Americans and British people are exposed to, and then of course compounded by the Cold War and a lack of interest and access to the Soviet Union.
So to build on that, when we think of something like, I don't know, the Battle of Monte Cassino, we have a range of nationalities involved in that battle, from those who are actively participating in it to the civilians who are around there, so we can probably build up a very accurate understanding of the campaign there. But as you just said there, the British and Canadians are liberating German camps. The Soviets are liberating camps in Poland and elsewhere. So that the armies that are doing the liberating have different ways of processing things. The regimes, democracies they're fighting for have different ideas and doctrine, and the camps they are uncovering have been organized on for different reasons and the different methods. So does that mean that we've got a slightly skewed perspective of 1945? To have a full view of this, wouldn't we have ideally had lots of Brits in to liberate Auschwitz along the side of the Soviets and have, you see what I mean with this? You know, we've got windows on this whole experience, but they're specific to the nation that's doing the liberating and the areas where they were.
Yeah, I mean, and you know, Auschwitz again is a great example of this. You know, there are some amazing documentary. Well, when I say documentary, I mean like archival film footages of Auschwitz. You can find them on the Holocaust Museum website, for example. But they're a mixture of, you know, film footage that's filmed at the liberation. You can tell this because there's snow on the ground. And like recreations. So, you know, like reenactments. There's a very famous photograph. It's a still from one of the liberation films of children, and they're walking sort of along this corridor between the wires. And some of them are the twins from from Mengele's twins experiments. Eva and Core is one of them. And that's actually a reconstruction. I mean, they set them up and they filmed it, you know, months after, you know, liberation. And so the Soviets are very much looking at the camps as propaganda. That's not always a bad thing. The Americans do it too. Just propaganda meaning, you know, media with a message, I guess. But one of the things I think that you see differently is that almost from the beginning, the Soviets, and this is why the higher level Extraordinary State Commission reports aren't as great, the Soviets begin to flatten the victim groups. They don't recognize Jews as a particular victim of the Holocaust. If you go to, so when I was doing my research for the first book, and I was in Belarus, and I went to this town, and there's a memorial to 1,000 peace-loving Soviet citizens murdered by the fascist occupiers. Now they're all Jews. They're all Jews, but Jews are not mentioned, right? Because the Soviets have a policy which is don't divide the dead, which is ultimately anti-Semitic, because they don't want to give Jews special sort of victim status, and so they lump all the victims of the Nazis into one category. And you see this at Auschwitz. You know, the first memorial didn't have a recognition in writing that Jews were a victim group. It was only nations, you know, France, Netherlands, Germany, etc., but not Jews as a particular victim group. And you know, then also it's, again, this is memory stuff, but I think it's fascinating, and I hope that the audience is finding it interesting too. You know, for non-Jewish Poles, Auschwitz has a different meaning as well. And so, you know, Auschwitz I is a site of predominantly non-Jewish Polish suffering, and they sort of gravitate to that site, while Birkenau, where the gas chambers were, is a Jewish place. And you know, this is an example of how memory becomes something that really people care about an awful lot. And, you know, it means a lot in developing what World War II meant. In the case of Poles, you know, Auschwitz I becomes a place of Polish suffering because lots of non-Jewish Polish political prisoners are sent there. They're murdered there. They're tortured there, etc. You know, and that becomes a focus. And the other stuff, not so much. And that also kind of becomes a way to overlook other elements of the wartime experience in Poland that might be less comfortable. I mean, same thing with the Americans, and I'll turn this lens right back on Americans. You know, there's a reason why we had a museum to the Holocaust in the United States in 1979, and we only just now have a museum to the African American experience. And that's because in the Holocaust experience, despite some evidence to the contrary in things like immigration, etc., we're the heroes. And so liberation is great because look, it's the strong, square-jawed, corn-fed American soldier, bringing freedom and liberation to oppressed people. And all that's true. But it's also very easy to tell that story. It's much more difficult to tell Leon Bass's story or the story of African Americans in the United States and what they had to go through, because that's not a triumphant story. We're not, we white Americans or European Americans are not the heroes in that story. Many of us are deeply, have things to sort of answer for. And again, not individually, but, it's not a story of great American, bringing freedom to the world. And so, I mean, I think that, again, liberation plays a part of that as well. And it helps Americans in some sense, sometimes, maybe not explicitly, but to overlook other elements, because we can play the hero in that. In many ways, I would argue kind of the same way that the kinder transport works in the UK, where it's like, yay, look how awesome we were. We took all these kids in, but we're not going to talk about what happened to the parents or why we wouldn't take the parents in.
It's as people saying in the sidebar, it's selective history. We're all guilty of that all the time. But just to bring things to an end, although I fear it might be a big rabbit hole, language and its use, because even in your relatively short career, given that your age about the Holocaust, the use of words and what is meant to by a certain word as umbrella phrases is changing and evolving. We're in a society now where labels and pronouns are very important. They're important discussions. So a couple of questions that come in that maybe you can address generally. So Baskerville said concentration camps were not extermination camps, not by purpose, by certainly by effect. And Sean Brown is referring to Snyder's book, has said that our knowledge on extermination camps is limited, but we have the evidence of concentration camps. Most concentration camps were not extermination camps. And then we had the other comment from, where is it here? Peace to you. Great content as always. I have a question about modern day references to relocation centers in the US, like Manzanar, where Japanese citizens were sent. Is it fair to call them a concentration camp? So that's kind of a representation of views of where we are on labeling. Death camps, extermination camps, work camps, concentration camps. Is the Holocaust just Jewish victims? Is the Holocaust every one of the 11 million? If you die as a result of bad treatment, but you weren't actually being sent there to be killed, is that the same? Unpack that for us, Waitman. How do you confront that as a Holocaust historian? What is it okay that labels and definitions change and evolve?
Yeah, I mean, amazing questions, and all of them are right on the pulse of sort of, I think, what's important. So let me talk about the Holocaust one first, because this is something it's a little bit difficult, and I've sort of coined the phrase, and I use the phrase the Nazi genocidal project, of which the Holocaust is a part, perhaps the for them their most important angle, but also includes, I argued, there's a genocide of Soviet prisoners of war, of whom 3.3 million are murdered by the Nazis because they're Soviet POWs. We also have the disabled and the handicapped, and LGBT folks, Sinti Roma. So there's lots of different groups, right? Political prisoners, etc. Generally speaking, yes, Jews constitute sort of the greatest, I suppose, victim group in the Holocaust. Though, for example, in teaching, if you take a course on the Holocaust and it doesn't include disabled and these other groups, it's not a great course. So there is some slippage there where we consider sort of other Nazi victim groups to be sort of victims of the Holocaust. If one wants to be particularly specific about Jewish victimhood during the Nazi regime, you use the term Shoah, which means specifically the Nazi program to exterminate Jews. There's also Poramos, which is the Sinti Roma. They have their own term. Poramos is their suffering as well, specifically only Sinti Roma, pejoratively gypsies, right? So there's that. So Holocaust it's a slightly more malleable term than Shoah. It obviously doesn't ever lose it. The Jews are sort of the first victim group of the Nazis, and they are a central group in that. And of course, remember, had the Nazis been successful in Eastern Europe, they explicitly planned to murder between 30 and 40 million Slavic non-Jewish people.
Yeah.
So again, had things gone a different route, we might be talking much more about that group. Anyway, so Holocaust is it's a term that I think is more inclusive, at least the way I use it. It's more inclusive. I will include some of those other groups while never losing sight of the fact that Jews are the primary victim group in there. And then Shoah is much more sort of explicit. But the concentration camps question, which is another good one, I never use the word death camps. Because death camps to me, again, and this is me as a Holocaust historian, death camps is imprecise. As someone pointed out, even in the question, the Nazis intentionally murder people in all the camps. And they intentionally let people die from starvation and disease and other things in all the camps. So every camp, in a certain sense, is a death camp. It's not a helpful term. But extermination center is, and there are only really 4 extermination centers, and those are Auschwitz. Those are Auschwitz, Majdanek, maybe, definitely Auschwitz, Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and Chelmno. These are places, particularly those last group. Auschwitz is a hybrid because Auschwitz is also a slave labor camp as well as a factory camp and an extermination site. But the Reinhard camps and Chelmno are places whose sole purpose was the mass murder of other human beings.
Yeah.
There was no labor there, with the exception of the small group that supported the running of the camp itself. There's no punishment there. They're not a place for people to go and be punished and imprisoned, and that is different, and it deserves to be noted as such. So I don't think it's accurate to say that Dachau is an extermination center. It's not. It's a concentration camp, and of course, concentration camp itself, you can define even more narrowly as a location that falls under the Inspectorate of Camps, which is a Nazi organization. So, for example, the camp that I write on, the concentration camp, and I call it a concentration camp even though it's not, Janowska was never under the Inspectorate of Camps until 1944. And also, I think it's important to recognize that even concentration camp in the Holocaust, in the Nazi context, is still a umbrella term. As I said, there are 40,000 different camps and ghettos. Some are literally a factory with a fence around it. Some are Auschwitz. Some are Dachau. Some are road building projects that move along as a highway is being built in Eastern Europe. So there's an incredible diversity of what a concentration camp experience is. Dora Mittelbau, even there, there's 2 different forms of slave labor. One is building the V2 rockets. The other is actually hacking by hand the underground tunnels in which the V2 rockets are built. And those are fundamentally different experiences. It's pretty much great to be on the building V2 rockets detail, but if you're the one who has to hack it out of the rock, you die. And that's where the 90% of people that die doing that. So I think that, that it's important to recognize there's a diversity here, but there is a really, I think, clear distinction between extermination centers and concentration camps. The last point about Manzanar, yes, absolutely. The Japanese detention camps are concentration camps. The word concentration camp is not coined by the Nazis. It's a British invention.
Brits. That's us. Yeah, that's our one.
Yep, from the Boer War. And at its most basic level, it really means just a mass imprisonment of people,
grouping together people confined. Yeah,
confining people, but I think we would add to it a level of illegality without due process, and based on who they are, right?
Based on some kind of
immutable characteristic
label. Yeah.
And so the Yes, absolutely. The Japanese internment camps are concentration camps. The American plantations during the antebellum South, the United States, I would argue, are slave labor camps, if not concentration camps.
Mm.
If you look at what they're doing and how they're set up, they are a form of that. There are similar things during the Cambodian genocide. I would argue that Guantanamo Bay now, at a certain level, is a concentration camp. Um, it doesn't have to be. We don't have to mystify the term. Obviously, Guantanamo Bay is not Auschwitz, but both can be concentration camps because, again, if we sort of consider it to be a kind of extrajudicial confinement in a sort of space based on immutable characteristics, that opens the door to lots of different places. I think that's okay. I think comparison is important. It doesn't mean that one thing is the same as the other, and it doesn't mean that we're playing the suffering Olympics of one thing is worse than the other. I mean, obviously Auschwitz is worse than Guantanamo Bay, but I mean, I don't think it cheapens the Holocaust experience to look at the Holocaust and see if there are parallels to other historical events.
Well, I think that has to be the way moving forward, is to be inclusive about it, to make comparisons to other situations, eras that more people have some kind of vested interest in. Is that I don't, for example, have any Jewish family. I don't have any Jewish ancestors to my knowledge. So that means I could, well, it's nothing to do with me then. I'm not interested in that. But I have got people in my family who are disabled or have mental health issues or are activists. And so the more we can, as human beings, connect with atrocities, be it a recent one or an awful one, or a part in the past, or some sort of internment against one's will without due course and process, I think that has to be a positive thing to be able to create that connection, to create that understanding.
And this is something that Leon talks about, because Leon, I mean, he's an amazing guy, and if you have an extra 2 hours or whatever, you should go listen to his.
Yeah, I put the link to the short 2.5-minute one and a 2-hour one in the description. So go and watch that later on.
But Leon goes on after the war. It takes a while for him to process, his anger. He becomes a school principal, and then he, beginning in like the 70s, he makes it his job to sort of go talk about his experiences. But one of his takeaways, and he says it explicitly in his testimony, is if it can happen to them, it can happen to me.
Yeah,
that's what Woody's talking about here. I think with this sort of recognition of our shared humanity, and that this is a human condition, and I mean our tendency to discriminate against and oppress minorities and do awful things to them is a human trait, for better or worse.
Well, it starts with blame, doesn't it? We like to blame anything that's going wrong on someone that isn't us, and we blame downwards, don't we? Generally,
yeah.
We punch down,
and we want to say, as a result, in another element, that the Nazis are these crazy people. That's why the Holocaust happened, because the Nazis are these crazy, fanatically evil people. Whereas 99% of Nazis perpetrators are psychologically normal human beings.
Yeah.
That's more scary, but it's easier for us to say, well, the Nazis did that. That's crazy. That's the Holocaust. You can't compare something to Holocaust because that's sort of unique and beyond comparison. But that also allows us to then not have to confront things that might be similar, that we might be experiencing or doing, right? And so, I mean, I think your point there is spot on, that it's about our basic shared humanity. That, like, I don't have to be Jewish to empathize and to recognize the way that they were treated, or to see parallels, not identical one-to-one comparisons, but parallels in how other people are treated and how systems of governments and organizations evolve, as you're pointing out, to sort of scapegoat vulnerable groups or whatever. That is not something that's unique to the Holocaust.
Yeah, and so often the perpetrators are the mid-management. It's just the supervisory level of people that do the most horrific thing. It's the people processing the documentation that scare the fuck out of me with the Holocaust in some ways more than the people actually at the camps. It's the people just who've gone from being an accountant for something else to being an accountant for the extermination of human beings in a very easy move to make without it seeming, and that scares the crap out of me. That really does.
Well, I think
It's in all of us, I think, unfortunately.
there's a great example. Excuse me. This guy named Jacobus Lenz, and he was in Amsterdam. He was a Dutch civil servant, and his job was basically, registry. And he created these amazing visualizations of where Jews lived in Amsterdam, sorted in all different ways, by family relation, by job, by whatever. And he gave them all to the Nazis, obviously. And the Nazis then used them to round up the Jews. And I think, and somebody mentioned this in the chat a little bit, I think what's interesting also that as a Holocaust historian, and I rarely get on the what are the lessons from the Holocaust, because sometimes I feel like that gets very sort of Hallmark card very quickly. But I think one of the lessons, one of the uncomfortable ones, is that we always imagine ourselves as the victims. We always imagine ourselves as the Jews, or as the political prisoners, or the resistance fighters, right? Because that's easy in a certain sense. Like, what would I do? But statistically and historically speaking, we're much more likely to be that civil servant just doing our job,
Yeah.
or someone looking the other way, while bad things are happening to other people, that we could step up and do something about it. So I think one of the uncomfortable lessons of the Holocaust is that we really need to think about ourselves as perpetrators, and what would we do? How would we avoid becoming a perpetrator? How do we avoid becoming part of the system? Rather than thinking the other way, because we all like to imagine that we would be the ones that would punch the Nazis in the face and take in a Jewish family, and I'd like to think that, but I don't know that I would do that or not.
It's the old adage of, when do you step in when your neighbor's beating his dog? That kind of thing. Is it, at what point do you stand up and go, okay, this is too much? And yeah, we all should learn something about speaking out, I think. But wait, man, we will bring things to an end, because it's getting all gloomy now, and I don't want to be gloomy on a Thursday night. But wait, man, tell us just briefly what you've got coming up on the podcast, and I've put a link in there, the description below. If people out there haven't discovered his podcast, what do you essentially do with your Holocaust history podcast?
Yeah, so thanks for that plug. Please do check it out. It's available. It's the Holocaust History Podcast. It's available on iTunes and or Apple Podcasts and Spotify and every place else. And basically what I'm trying to do, it's not a sort of narrative by me. So you don't have to listen to me talk. It's not me sort of laying out the history of the Holocaust. Each week I bring on an expert to talk about a particular area of the Holocaust, in terms and language that we can all understand. So it's not a sort of for academics or that kind of stuff. And we've had all kinds. I've had people talking about the ghettoization, about Mengele, about Holocaust testimony and how we understand it, about various camps in detail. I had Rudolf Hess's grandson. Rudolf Hess was a commandant of Auschwitz. His grandson coming on, talk about sort of family. Really, I mean, anything that you might be interested in, you probably should find at least one. Any topic you might be interested in general in life, you might find one episode at least that talks about that. So it's not one of those things you have to listen to in order or anything like that. You can just come on and sort of look down the titles and see what you might be interested in. And then there's a reading list associated with it as well. So many guests have books, not all of them, but some have a book that they've written. But they also each week give a recommendation for a book on the Holocaust. And so I've cataloged that as well, so you can check that out.
Well, brilliant stuff. So thanks for mentioning that. And folks, I'm taking a few days because I'm going back to the UK for my mum's funeral next week, which is a very sad event, and then I'm back to World War II planning after that. So thank you, Waitman, for joining us. Thank you, everybody, for your comments and questions. As always, click like and subscribe. Visit my guests' websites, buy their books, support their projects, because otherwise history won't get talked about and they won't be able to do it. So support everybody you can in any way you can. So thanks, everybody. See you all next time. Bye.